I'm Chris Farrell, and this is On Watch. Welcome to On Watch, everybody, the Judicial Watch podcast, where we go behind the headlines to cover news and information the mainstream media doesn't want you to know about. We try to recover some lost history and explain the inexplicable. Today, to explain the inexplicable, I am very pleased to introduce to you Mary Margaret Olohan, senior reporter for the Daily Signal. Mary Margaret is also the author of Detrans, which is a fabulous book that looks at this radical gender ideology cult that is seemingly has been and continues to sweep the nation. Mary Margaret, welcome to On Watch.
Thanks so much for having me.
Glad to have you with us. So, besides all the reporting that you do at Daily Signal, which is tremendous unto itself, you've written a very important book that looks at something that just, it seems like there's like a drumbeat of reporting on this. It seems both frequency and in scale, it is a major cultural issue for the United States. And that is this radical gender ideology that now results in surgeries. Tell us about your book, Detrans, and give us the overview before I give you a bunch of detailed questions.
Well, I was inspired to write this book because I was reporting on gender ideology, I would say maybe 3 or 4 years ago, before it had become the really cool thing to talk about. And I think that was before Governor Youngkin won the election in Virginia, and there were a lot less reporters who were focused on the culture war issues. Which for me at the time, I was like, this is great. I'm the only person that's writing about this,
right.
On the right.
Monopolized it.
Yeah, it was kind of fun. But then at the same time, once there was more of a fervor to cover these culture war issues, then there was just this explosion of digging into this and investigating, and all of these things were coming out, partially propelled, I think, by COVID and people understanding what their kids were being taught when they weren't there, or people understanding what their teachers were pushing on these children unbeknownst to them. And so now there really is this dearth of reporting on these issues. But what I really was inspired by was this story that I wrote on gender affirming care back in, I think, 2020, 2021, the euphemism that the left uses to describe trans surgeries, hormones, and puberty blockers, even for kids. But at the time, we didn't really know what that meant, the gender affirming care phrase. And I thought, there's no way that this phrase, which all of the mainstream media outlets were using, I thought there's no way this actually means surgeries. It must mean maybe just social transition. So for example, using someone's pronouns and preferred name.
Or counseling,
yeah,
right? They're having an identity crisis, and maybe we can work through this.
Exactly, and I think it's designed actually to sound like that. It sounds simple, kind, loving. It's created by, the phrase is created by these groups like the HRC, GLAAD, the ACLU, and they, in their media style guides, go to the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, and say, this is how you should talk about this issue. Do not say trans surgeries, hormones, and puberty blockers. Always use this phrase because otherwise you are offending trans-identifying people.
And you're also accurately describing what's going on.
Right,
It's when abortion is referred to as women's reproductive health care.
Right.
It has nothing to do with reproduction. In fact, it's trying to stop and terminate reproduction.
Exactly.
And it's not health care. And this is all Marxism 101. This is an effort to control and manipulate language. And they always do it. They do it very, very craftily. And so gender affirming care, and it's not really care. We can talk about that more. But in your book, Detrans, give us kind of an outline or a sketch. What do you cover in the book?
So we tell the stories of young people who tried to transition, to do the unthinkable, to become, let's say, go from a girl to becoming a boy, and then realized, of course, that this is impossible. You cannot actually do that. And once they got to that point, that realization, they had already undergone, let's say, puberty blockers, hormones, surgeries, irreversible ones. And they got to this point and realized, oh my gosh, I've been lied to. I have been betrayed by the medical industry, and they have to pick up the pieces of their lives and figure out what to do. And so my book is the real reported stories of people that this actually happened to, that lived this tragedy. And they share a lot of really intimate, vulnerable details with me. They tell me about, what social media they were using, what their parents knew, what their parents didn't know, where they got the hormones. Planned Parenthood is one place.
Secrecy is a big
them.
part of this whole thing, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, a lot of this is a clandestine effort
Absolutely.
to operate off the radar screen of parents or other sort of authority figures.
Right.
This is all done in secret until it's kind of, I guess, thrust upon,
Exactly.
or exposed as being, I want to change everything about me kind of a thing.
Right, and while it's being done in secret, the messaging from these gender activists or school counselors or therapists is, if your parents don't condone this, or if they don't affirm you when they find out, or if they are not on board with this, that means they hate you and they want you dead.
Right.
And it sounds dramatic, but that's legitimately what these kids are told.
Which is another technique of driving a wedge, right?
Right.
Between authority figures, between family, any sort of responsible adult who would say, well, let's just hit the pause button here a second. What do we do, and let's talk about this? Well, that means you're against us.
Exactly.
It's an attempt to create or paint people as enemies and monsters.
Right, and to really, ostracize these kids from their parents and to help the kids think, teenagers are already kind of susceptible to this type of thinking. We all know teenagers are very rebellious and they think their parents don't understand. Well, when you add into that this gender factor, and once you are part of the so-called trans community, if you're a young kid that's going down this path, you're told that you're part of a very select, persecuted minority victim group, and that people aren't going to understand what you're going through, and they're going to hate you and want you dead. So you need to stay in this tight circle. You need to think of yourself as a victim, but you also need to think of yourself as very brave and admirable for daring to, go against the grain here.
Right.
So all of this for these young people is making them not only pretty entitled about the whole thing, but also feeling like I must protect this identity, especially from my parents, at all costs. And it really contributes to this very cult-like atmosphere, which is why in the subhead of my book I say victims of the gender ideology cult.
Right.
Because this is very much has a lot of the signs of a cult, the secrecy with which it's done,
right.
The love bombing that these young people experience by these activists and by these teachers and therapists, the way that they're drawn in, the way people are held out. And then after they transition and they realize, oh my gosh, I can't actually transition, and try and speak up about it, the members of the transgender community vilify them, hate them, will say the most horrible things. They're cast aside, they're told you were never actually transgender, you were never one of us, and they're just thrown to the wayside.
So way back in the 1970s, there was this idea of, and it was famous by a few different people who I guess were forerunners in this whole gender dysphoria thing, where they would talk about sex change operations. That was the language that was used in the 1970s. No one says sex change anymore.
No.
And the reason why they don't is because you can't change your sex.
Right.
Chromosomes are chromosomes. That's your pairing. And so they get in trouble. They used to get in trouble in the earlier days of this whole kind of craze because they couldn't say sex change. It's false advertising, literally,
right.
in the sense of we can't give you surgery, drugs, counseling, and change your sex because you can't
right.
change your sex. And that's an important point for people to realize is that a lot of this is language, a lot of this is sort of almost like marketing strategy to convince people that something that's abhorrent is wonderful. And that's just one small example, but you won't hear it referred to as sex change surgery, something that used to be said many, many moons ago, but not anymore.
I think that language part is so interesting, especially as a reporter, because I spend all day, writing my own stories. I'm very aware of the impact that words can have. Like the example you used earlier of reproductive health care.
Right.
I see Washington Post reporters all the time say fetal cardiac activity instead of heartbeat.
Right.
I've seen the National Abortion Rights Action League's media guide where they tell reporters what to say and what not to say, and are very open about the fact that they want them to say certain words in order to increase abortion access. And so they don't make any bones about it anymore. The fact that these establishment media outlets are on the side of the gender activists.
By far.
And
yeah.
that blows my mind.
Well, go back to, just look at the former governor of Virginia, Ralph Northam, right? Who's a pediatric neurosurgeon, right? So if anybody knows about when a baby's alive, when it isn't alive, and he very famously did the radio interview where essentially he advocated for postnatal abortion.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. The infant will be kept comfortable, and then the parents will
decide.
decide.
Then we'll talk about it and decide if we're going to
yeah.
kill it or not. And somehow that's supposed to be okay. And it's mind-boggling. So I'm sure everybody's story is a little bit different of the folks that you were interacting with and interviewing and kind of learning their stories. But my gut instinct, and I could be totally wrong, is that the persons that you kind of profile or look at, my guess is that there's probably some underlying unresolved emotional disturbance or problem before they ever got to the point where they decided, I want to change my gender, because you can't say sex in this.
Right.
Maybe there's some emotional disturbance. Maybe there's somewhere on the Asperger scale. Maybe my gut is that there's some emotional issue underlying the conditions in the home, the person themselves, and that when exploited or when pushed down a certain decision path turns into this gender issue.
Yeah, you're very on point there. The detransitioners that I talked to, and I profiled 4 girls and 1 boy for this book, but I talked to a lot of other people for the project.
Right.
The detransitioners who I profiled in the book, first of all, every single one of them had mental health issues. And I think that's something we don't talk about enough, is that most of the kids, if not all of the kids, who are trying to become another gender or think that they're transgender have mental health issues. And that could be one diagnosed one or several undiagnosed ones, but this is a reality. And so they, first of all, do need help. They really do. They need care, but not this gender affirming care, which is only going to make their symptoms worse and going to push them down a path and mess up their bodies. And they do deserve help and care, but unfortunately they're not getting it. So what I found with a lot of these young people that I was talking to, and I'll specifically talk about the girls right now because these girls we're seeing more and more of them who are trying to transition due to social contagion factors. For a lot of these girls, they were from families where a parent was not doing well. For example, where one of their mothers was very emotionally reticent, where one of the mothers was an alcoholic, where parents were going through a divorce, where parents were already separated, where there was a parent that was cheating. There's just always a factor like that present. I asked all of them if they were from families that were practicing their faith. None of them were, they might have a little bit of faith in the background. None of their families were like solidly practicing a faith, church-going families. None of these kids played sports when they were little. That was just something that I had been talking to some experts who had told me that was a good question to ask, whether any of them played sports, because I think statistics show that most kids who play sports are healthier and have better mental health.
And there's a certain kind of socializing that takes place when you're on a team, whether you're playing baseball or soccer or whatever. You have to interact with people, and a lot goes on. And it's very, very good for kids' formation and team building and so. That was just something that I asked everyone, but I think that some of the things that I saw in all of these stories were they were lonely, they didn't fit in, they were often on the autism spectrum, whether they were diagnosed or found out later. They were going through puberty. They felt like they were the only one in the world going through puberty. Which means automatically you're kind of a mess.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, even in the best of circumstances, there's a lot of physical, chemical issues going on. So it makes it more complicated, just a fact.
Exactly, and I think what a lot of kids nowadays don't realize, especially because of social media, that makes everyone think that everyone else is doing well and having a good time.
They're comparing their insides to somebody else's outsides.
Exactly, the best picture of someone else's life.
So they're looking at somebody on social media who looks perfect, right? Everything about them is perfect, and they say to themselves, well, I'm horrible, I'm not angry.
Exactly.
I'll never be like that, or whatever. Whether it's, you could pick a sports star or model, whatever.
Exactly.
They don't think that they could be that.
And I think that factors in a lot more than people understand. I'll get to that in a moment. But when it comes to puberty, I think a lot of these kids are just not understanding that it happens to everyone.
Right.
And everyone has a hard time going through puberty, and it's not an easy thing. But for a lot of these kids, they're struggling going through puberty, and when they have certain factors that make them think, oh, I must not be a girl because I don't like this, or I feel weird about this, or I don't want to wear a bra, or things like that, they are too easy victims of the gender ideology activists who will say, it's because you're a guy.
Right.
And what I found with a lot of these girls, and I think this is really fascinating, it's one of my big takeaways from the book, was that a lot of these girls are getting on the internet around, let's say, age 12 or 13. That's when Chloe Cole was first getting on Instagram. And there's a cocktail of factors here that caused her to be interested in gender ideology. For starters, she's on Instagram. And for most girls who are looking at older women, when I say older women, I just mean women that are older than them, they're trying to see what a woman is. They're trying to understand, what am I supposed to be? I want to be the best version of a woman. I want to be attractive. I want to be loved. What does that look like? So she's on Instagram looking for that.
Yeah, that's the last place to look.
Exactly.
Right.
It's a dangerous place to be looking for this. So what she's seeing is these women who are perfectly sculpted, and they've got all these male admirers. They're probably dressed kind of scantily clad,
Yeah, sure.
scandalously, and she's seeing all these women and thinking, okay, well, they're getting a lot of attention. I don't look anything like that. She's a 12, 13-year-old girl. She just thinks, I don't look anything like that. I don't really know how to be that. So she's, setting that aside, thinking, I don't know how to do that. At the same time, she and many other people, especially the girls I talked to in my book, are exposed to pornography pretty much as soon as they get online. And we know that most kids nowadays, if you have a phone, if you're not being supervised, you will almost certainly be exposed to pornography.
Yep.
So Chloe's seeing these girls depicted in really degrading and humiliating ways. And she's thinking, that looks terrible. That looks horrible. She's scared of it. And the girls in the book told me, that doesn't look fun for women, it looks fun for men. And so when you combine that, this kind of fear of sexual intimacy created by the pornography she's seeing, and then these images of women that she's seeing that she's afraid of, she's thinking, I don't know how to be a woman, and I also don't think I want to be. And then at the same time, these gender activists are pushing all this content online. She's stumbling on it, whether she's interested in anime or whatever group she's in online. She's really stumbling on this gender content everywhere. And they're saying to her, oh, you feel like you're not a woman? You're scared of sexual intimacy as a woman? It's because you're not a woman. It's because you're a guy. And for Chloe, this just was the perfect cocktail of events that really pushed her down this path.
You can see it. I mean, and sadly, we also have an American culture now where instead of going outside to play, and when the streetlights come in, which is kind of my upbringing a million years ago, you took off. You went on bikes and you ran around. You did stuff.
Yeah.
We got in trouble, but okay, fine. We weren't sitting in the corner of the room with the device in our face, doing this for hours on end. And today, you've either got kids isolated on some kind of a device, feeding on all the stuff that you just described, or these very artificial play dates with parents hovering over every interaction and every word. And this is really kind of a sick, in my opinion, it's kind of a sick environment because the kid is either hyper-managed or completely isolated in a fantasy world. And neither is like, at least in my opinion, and I'm an old guy, none of that is normal. None
of it's normal. It's so bad for our youth. And I think I would go even further. They're not just in the corner of the room on the phone. A lot of these kids go up to their bedroom and lock the door and they're on the phone.
Right.
And that, I think, it gives me chills just thinking about it because especially if there's no kind of restrictions on these kids' phones, anything, they're exposed to anything.
Right.
And for some of the girls in the book, Luca Hine, for example, she was preyed upon on the internet. She had a lot of different adults soliciting pictures from her, information from her. Some of these were men who identified as women. So they're soliciting this content from her. And as a young girl, she fell for this. She was very much a victim of these predators, and that very much propelled her down this path. And I think it's something you should be worried about even aside from gender ideology, but with this gender ideology component, it's a big deal. And for a lot of parents, I don't know if they realize, but some of these social media apps are explicitly engineering this content to kids, such as Snapchat, which may be a little outdated at this point. It was cooler a couple of years ago. But Snapchat has a whole feature where if you swipe to the left, there's a whole array of what they call stories. And they're technically like news stories, but what they are little snippets from Planned Parenthood, ACLU, GLAAD, about content that's very inappropriate for kids, such as polyamory, thruples, how to get an abortion without your parents knowing, all of this. And all you have to do on Snapchat, swipe to the left, click on the story, and it's all at your fingertips. And this is something that I think, Snapchat might be thought by many parents as rather a harmless app, but this is one of those things where it's really an avenue towards this gender activism. And what will happen is, these kids They're online, they're lonely, they're looking for meaning, they're looking for identity and purpose, which is another problem with our culture today, is we really lack an understanding of identity. And they're looking for all of that, and they find it in gender ideology. And so they really lean into it. And the parents don't understand until their beautiful daughter comes to them and says, I'm a boy, I need you to call me Andrew, he, him, and I would like to get hormones and surgery. And my teacher says, if you don't, I might kill myself. And that's a predicament that a lot of American parents are finding themselves in. And, I have so much sympathy for modern parents because, this is an unprecedented crisis. This is not something parents should have to deal with. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, what's happening is the daughter comes to them and they think, this is my beautiful baby girl. I don't want her to get a double mastectomy. That sounds crazy. My gut says we shouldn't do any of this, but maybe they're not politically in tune. They're not equipped with the resources they need. So what they do is they go to the medical professionals because they trust that they'll know what to do. And these doctors and therapists will tell them, oh no, you have to affirm her because she believes she's a boy, then she is. And the exact line that they're given, and this gives me chills every time I say it because it is so horrific. The exact line that these parents are given is, would you rather have a dead daughter or a living son?
Yeah, that's a perversion of something else. But so here's one of the things that makes me nuts. We've already discussed how a lot of the individuals in this case we'll stick with the girls, but it goes with the guys too. There's some underlying issue. Mm-hmm. They're emotionally disturbed in some way. Whether it's because of their environment, where they have crazy parents with drugs and alcohol and fighting and divorce and turmoil there, or whether they just, maybe they're not exactly wired 100%. Yeah. Maybe it's a kid with a little psychosis, which happens also. It's nobody's fault. It's just the circumstances, right?
Right.
But at some point, you just described a situation where parents are taking kids to go see some gender-affirming counselor, doctor.
Yeah.
So 2 questions. One is this also frequently a parental failure? They simply say, look, I understand what you're saying, but no. Or at least, okay, I understand what you're saying. Let's wait. If what you're saying is true, it'll be true a year from now. It'll be true 2 years from now, right? And the same thing with respect to the parents' interactions with the professionals, the medical professionals. But the other part of this to me is, where's the money?
Right.
Because someone is doing this there's got to be big dollars involved in this.
Yeah, I think that I would first should have a disclaimer here that there definitely are parents out there who do this on purpose to their kids. There are parents, especially when they take toddlers, who will say, I have a trans kid, and they will be doing this very obviously for attention, and that's a very evil, selfish, narcissistic
So the parents
thing
are
to do.
sick. There's something wrong with them.
Exactly.
They say that their 2-year-old knows what their gender is.
And it's very much Instagram mom attempt to say, like, look at me, I'm so loving and diverse, and I have a trans child. It's very much an attention-seeking maneuver. But I think in general what has been going on, and this is based on my interviews with parents on this issue in a variety of spectrums, is that the parents are not in tune enough with the culture. They're just, average people who are living, they're content with their life, they're raising their family, but they're not super in tune with politics, and they're not paying attention to the gender debate. And so when this happens, yes, they should absolutely do more research and, be prepared to handle it, but they're not. And so when it happens, they really do trust the medical professionals. And you would think that more people would say, no, we need to just give it time. But the way the medical professionals, so-called, approach this is, no, urgently, your child needs gender-affirming care. And the urgency there is from the activist claim that kids will kill themselves if they don't get gender-affirming care.
Is there any data from anyone that shows mass teenage suicides?
No. In fact, what we're finding out now is that gender-affirming care, and I hate even using that phrase, but I'm just trying to be explained properly, these transgender surgeries, hormones, and puberty blockers, administering these to kids, especially the kids with mental health issues, is actually causing more issues for these kids, which, no duh, we all knew that. But unfortunately, these gender activists and experts will try and say things such as, the dangers of suicidal ideation outweigh the risk of puberty blockers causing long-term damage. I was literally just reading this yesterday in this researcher's work on puberty blockers. She's acknowledging that they can cause serious issues in kids' bone density. She's literally doing research on this. And at the same time, she's like, but because kids might kill themselves if they don't get access to this, we should give it to them anyways.
Yeah, this is like, I've used this, try to describe it and just discuss it in other interviews with other people, but this is like, and this is stereotyping, so bear with me, but you have a teenage girl who looks in the mirror and she's perfect, but in her mind, she's obese. And so there's this whole anorexia, bulimia issue, right?
Yeah.
And you have very healthy, otherwise normal, fit young women who destroy themselves.
Yeah.
And it's a very serious issue, and people do die from it. And this is like telling somebody who's suffering from that, hey, how's your diet going? I mean, this is crazy. Right?
Yeah.
This is somebody who has, there's this dysphoria, there's this disconnect. Okay, they're in a guy's body and they think they want to be a girl or vice versa. And rather than saying, hey, listen, take a deep breath, hold on a second, and doing legitimate, real counseling and helping them work through issues,
right.
It's saying, well, you know what, we can totally rearrange your body and we're going to screw around with your brain chemistry, we're going to do it. So why, if it's not right to tell somebody suffering from bulimia or, how's your diet going, why can you not like blow the whistle and say, stop?
Right. Well, and I'm so glad you brought up anorexia because, first of all, I feel like anorexia was the last social contagion not too long ago. When I was in high school, anorexia was still huge. Half the girls I knew were anorexic. And Prisha, one of the girls in my book, legitimately was very, very anorexic when she began her gender journey, as the activists call it.
Which should be like an instant disqualifier.
Exactly.
Right?
In fact, it was ignored when she was talking to the gender activists about her transition. And when she went in for her surgery, this is insane. When she went in for her surgery, she told me, I was asking her, so how did you feel? What were you thinking? One of the things she was thinking was, yay, I'm going to lose 8 pounds when my breasts are removed, because she was still so anorexic. And something that I thought was really interesting was she was telling me that online, there's these pro-anorexia communities. So these poor girls are online in these anorexia communities, and they're posting progress photos of themselves starving themselves to death.
Themselves, yeah.
And so they're posting photos of themselves getting skinnier and skinnier, and because they're all very mentally ill, they're encouraging each other. They're saying, great job, keep going, you look so good. She said that this pro-anorexia community kind of bled into the pro-transgender community because there's the same thing. There's a lot of progress photos. Keep in mind, these are all nudes that these young people are posting online. They're just not realizing this. And so they're being exploited in that way as well.
Right.
But so she's posting all these photos in the pro-anorexia communities, the pro-transgender communities. You post progress photos of, facial hair coming in, or your body starting to look more male, or, your scars from your surgery. And so those really blended together. And I thought that was very interesting, considering how anorexia is right on the heels of this next social contagion, especially for girls, which is gender dysphoria.
And there was a time when joking about or teasing, or even comedians doing stand-up, even saying anything about anorexia, bulimia, or any of the other sort of eating issues, that was like, if you do that, there's like nothing worse. Like you're scum of the earth. How could you possibly make a joke about that?
Right.
So, I mean, it's the same thing, except in this case, instead of this image of whether you're fat or thin or fit or not or whatever, this is a sexual variation on that.
It is, it's a social contagion. And part of the reason I use that word is because Abigail Schreier, who I'm so respect so much, she wrote Irreversible Damage. And this was a book that honestly inspired me to write this book, because her book really got into the social contagion element of this and how all these young girls were identifying as transgender in groups, which is should be a serious alarm bell.
Another example.
Yeah.
It's like right off the bat, it's crazy.
It's
wrong.
trendy, it's cool, it's what we're doing together. And so a lot of these girls are going down this path out of, confusion. They're mentally ill, but also this is what their little friend group is doing. And so they're inspired to go at it that way. And I think on the anorexia front, for Prisha, for example, the girl I was just speaking about, she was so anorexic that when she, and this is very tragic, she was tragically raped when she was a young girl. And so at the same time, she was so anorexic that when she became pregnant, she couldn't carry the pregnancy. And she unfortunately miscarried her baby.
Because she was so sick from the anorexia.
Because she was so sick from the anorexia. And this was another reason that made her want to kind of reject her female body, because she thought not only had it allowed her to be assaulted, from as a woman, she didn't want that possibility again, but also she had failed as a woman to carry this baby. And a lot of these other factors that I was explaining earlier, from social media and all the other factors, made her think, you know what, I don't want any of this. I want to be a guy. I want to be rid of all of this. And so when she went in for a lot of these procedures or for her testosterone, she said her anorexia very rarely factored into the conversations about her desire to become a boy. Instead, it was all focused on her interest in becoming a boy and what procedures she wanted, and her mental health issues just weren't taken into account. So she's suing now, thankfully. She's suing, represented by Campbell Miller Payne, which is a law firm that's representing a lot of these detransitioners. Harmeet Dillon is also representing Chloe Cole and a number of them. But Chloe, and in Prisha's lawsuit, she says that her therapist did not take into account her mental health issues. And she argued, as Chloe argues...
Just think about that. The therapist didn't take into account mental health issues.
The most basic, fundamental
point.
starting point. And so she argues, as Chloe argues, that they could not properly give informed consent to these procedures because A, they were mentally unwell, and B, they didn't understand the impact of half of the things that were going to happen to them. Chloe had never, I believe Chloe had never even held hands with a boy. She had never kissed anyone. She had no idea if she wanted to have children one day. She had not thought about it. She was a kid.
She's making decisions off of Instagram or whatever.
Right. She didn't know if she wanted to breastfeed one day, and now she never will be able to because she doesn't have breasts anymore. So these are a lot of the things that now the detransitioners are grappling with, but at the time, they were kids. They had no idea, and they weren't properly explained to them.
And even going forward, let's say you find somebody out there who thinks, oh, this is the greatest thing in the world, and thank goodness I did it, and I'm happy, and I'm thrilled, and they're doing whatever they're doing in their new life, but they're basically permanent medical patients.
Yes.
I've talked to an MD on this same subject, and he said they're in for nonstop surgeries, basically forever, because their body that they're born with, their chromosomal identity, is in constant contradiction with everything that they've done to it.
Right.
And I guess depending upon how creative you want to be with plastic surgery, reconstructive surgery, all these other issues that come up, it's nonstop surgeries and medical issues forever.
And I think a lot of people don't realize that, where you're becoming a permanent invalid. And that was one of the reasons that one of the girls I was talking to decided she didn't want to do this anymore, because she was injecting herself in the leg with a massive needle every day with testosterone. And she said she developed such an aversion to the needle, and she thought, do I have to do this every day for the rest of my life? And then also she's continually paying for the hormones to continue taking these things. And so she and others realized, I am going to permanently be a patient. And that was another thing they told me when we were talking about we're doing a discussion of what they wish they knew and what they would like other people to know who are going down this path. And they told me, let other kids know that you're going to spend most of your time in the hospital or at the doctor's office or at the therapist's office. So your adolescence is not going to be very fun.
Right.
You're going to be spending a lot of time as a patient, just going through these transitions. And I think for those who go through surgery, it's even worse, obviously, because Prisha, for example, when she got her double mastectomy, she was trying to make enough money to pay for it, working at Panera. And she ended up getting fired from her job because she needed to rest and recuperate from her double mastectomy. She couldn't raise her arms because of this very invasive surgery.
Yeah, sure.
She would have ripped her scars, which is horrific. And so she got fired from her job, didn't have a source of income because she took too long to recover. And so that's another thing I think people don't realize is, a double mastectomy is not some magic little switch where suddenly you don't have breasts anymore.
Right.
Very invasive. Chloe Cole's scars still haven't properly healed, and it's been years since she got her operation. And that's also kind of just the starting point. Like if you get a double mastectomy as a girl and you still are struggling with gender dysphoria, or you want to continue down this path and get more surgeries, the next stop is a hysterectomy, then maybe facial masculinization, body sculpting to help yourself look more like a man, and then genital surgeries farther and farther down the line. It can go on and on and on. And as a patient of the medical system, you're going to continue to get recommended for surgeries. You're going to continue to be approved for surgeries.
And that's assuming they work.
Yeah.
Right? How many surgeries get screwed up?
Well, and work.
Or there's an infection.
Right.
Or there's complications.
Right.
Or there's, this is, even in the best of circumstances, for something conventional and kind of normal, a boring surgery, somebody has an appendectomy or something.
Right.
There's still risk, right? They can screw it up.
Of course.
And so imagine these complicated long-term issues. I would imagine the risks just go through the roof.
Of course, and then when we're not even talking about, and I don't want to be too graphic, but when it comes to the construction of ghost genitalia,
right,
and the use of, let's say, like intestines to create a faux penis on a woman, that's never going to work at all. But then there's all kinds of things that are done to make sure that she can urinate through that, which is also going to cause infections, which is going to, it's just a whole myriad.
A cascade of.
Yeah, and this is not only hard for the individual, it's disgusting. And I don't think we talk about that enough. It genuinely is disgusting. And, they're not only a patient constantly, but they're dealing with probable disgust at their own body and what is happening to them while they have to pretend that this is good, that this is helping them. And ultimately, for Richie, one of the guys that I talk about in the book, he has this absolutely heart-rending Twitter thread that I included a bit of it in the book to give a really good idea of just how tragic this is for men who allow themselves to be duped down this path. And I'm not gonna spell it out because it truly is graphic, but it's something that I described in chapter 8 of my book, how just absolutely Richie was butchered and how his life has been just irreversibly altered, and he's in constant physical pain, has to view himself as some kind of, as he put it, as some kind of monster. And I think that is such a tragedy, especially when we think about the fact that these are mentally ill people who are trusting medical professionals to help them. It's not like some horrible person going in there saying, do your worst. No, it's someone that thinks, I will be happier, I will be in a better place if I undergo this because you told me so.
Money.
Yeah.
Let's talk about money. Who's making money off of this?
Well, big pharma, of course. These doctors, these surgeons, these therapists. There's also these organizations now that are profiting a lot from this, such as Folks, which is Folx. Matt Walsh in the Daily Wire did a really interesting expose of a bunch of different groups that are supplying hormones that get delivered to your house, and they'll do it discreet packaging so that, let's say your parents don't know, or your boyfriend or girlfriend for some reason doesn't know. It's designed to go under the radar.
Right.
And so, I included a lot of figures in the book. I try and keep up to date on whether they're changing their prices. But I believe it was something like a 2-month supply of testosterone. It's like $80. But you keep doing that over and over and over if you want.
And forever, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to the surgeries, I want to say Prisha told me that her double mastectomy, it cost around $7,000. And $7,000 out of pocket for her. And that's just one surgery.
Right.
So when it comes to the financial incentives here, and I should caveat this by saying that I'm not the best person to talk about this because my focus was on the detransitioners.
Right.
So there's definitely people who can articulate this better. But there are absolutely incentives from places like the Human Rights Campaign, which has both a corporate equity guide and a medical equity guide. And the medical equity guide might have another name. But the idea behind these things is they score corporations and medical organizations and hospitals based on how gender affirming or inclusive they are.
Which is a shakedown. So
Exactly.
for people that aren't aware, whenever any of these nonprofits decide to give a corporation a score, it's a threat, right? Because if you don't do what we want you to do, we're going to tell the whole world you're a failure. Mm-hmm. And that means you're a hater. So you hate fill in the blank, whatever group, whatever identity you want to. And so do you think Coca-Cola or Bank of America or whatever,
Oreo,
whatever, do you think they want to walk around? Well, you failed the Human Rights Campaign qualification on this issue. They're terrified of that. They always want to have an A+.
Right.
And so you get an A+ when you adopt our language and put it in your personnel manual. Oh, and you wanted to give us $500,000. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, sir. And so magically, one of these nonprofit groups suddenly comes up, and they will, put the stamp of certification on these companies as soon as they adopt. Fox News has a transgender planner. I forget what the language is exactly, but they have an affirming policy in their
corporate
personnel manual about who can use which bathrooms, and they subscribe to all the official terminology that's put out by HRC and other groups as well, and they all get an A+.
They all do, and I've even noticed that if you look on some of these corporations' websites, they will tout the 100% rating from the HRC. And this is even going on at hospitals, at medical organizations. And I think when I started reporting on that about a year ago on these corporate equity guys, I was so demoralized realizing how much of a tight chokehold grip these activist groups have on our corporations and medical institutions.
Because they're terrified of getting a bad score.
They're terrified.
Being labeled, oh, you're a hater, you're this, you don't support whatever.
And so it's affecting our hospitals, it's affecting the next generation of doctors who are being taught to prioritize ideology over facts and science.
Yeah, and in that case, we both know, we won't go into the details of it, but I know of a medical professional who knows of instances at a very large hospital where this sort of quote-unquote gender-affirming care on children was being done. And he said, one of the biggest things was the price tag they could put on the surgery to install this, it's like a pump almost, or like a long-term hormone blocker to interrupt or to interfere in the normal development of the kid with respect to puberty blockers. And the price tag on surgically, installing or setting one of these was tens of thousands of dollars. It was a 20-minute procedure, but they got to charge numbers that were just like crazy. So there's a huge financial incentive for all this.
It's so upsetting, especially when you think about the fact that a lot of the time these are not wealthy families. These are families that are kind of scraping by. They might not really know how to do this. And a lot of the kids that I talked to from my book, who are not kids anymore, but they were kids when they were trying to do this, they tried to pay for this out of pocket, which is just, to me, I have a lot of siblings. Well, it's impossible, but also I have a lot of siblings. So I know what I can see very visually when I look at my siblings, what some of these younger teenagers are going through, emotionally, or the consternation that they might have trying to do this thing that they think is going to help them and trying to scrape up money. It's really tragic. And so, I think I have so much empathy for these young kids and for their families. And, like we were talking about earlier, the parents absolutely should have gone with their gut, should have done more research, should have done more to protect their kids. But I really do think that we're living in unprecedented times when, these parents should never have to deal with this. They should never have to deal with someone trying to get their kid to change their gender.
I mean, just a 14-year-old trying to comprehend what it takes to make or to raise $100,000. And these are the surgeries you're talking about. This big money, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, just a 14-year-old trying to comprehend that, $100,000, what does it take to do that? How do you get that money? Who's going to cover it? I mean, it's beyond their comprehension.
Right.
It certainly is beyond their ability to consent to anything like that.
Oh, yes.
So I guess as we close out, I just want to ask you one other area, one other topic we can chat about, and that is, there's another book that we discussed before we came on air, a very interesting book called Morning After the Revolution by a former New York Times reporter named Nellie Bowles. It's a very interesting book. I'm about 7/8 done with it. But she discusses, and this reflects, I think, on this whole idea of sexuality and human identity and that is the notion today, now, of feminism.
Mm-hmm.
There was a feminism that's sort of the, post-World War II, Phyllis Schlafly stepping out and coming at conservatism, coming at feminism from a conservative point of view. And then there's like generations of it, frankly. I don't know whether we're in the third, fourth, fifth, whatever generation we're in, but it's shifted over time, right? So your grandmother's feminism is different than yours, right? And what you grew up in and what your goals and expectations are. But even that's different from what these gender ideology people are pushing.
Right.
So explain some of the differences there.
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't subscribe to any version of feminism. I wouldn't consider myself a feminist, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, but I'm saying is like, so you're a professional woman and you're a reporter and you have your own career and life, and I mean, that's very different than 200 years ago, right?
This is
so
true.
It's a flavor. I don't mean it in sort of the radical, militant,
Women's March version of it.
I don't mean that. I mean that you get to pick and choose.
Yes.
That kind of a thing.
And I think what a lot of these gender activists are pushing now is the idea that there is an elite type of woman, which is a man who is a woman. That trans women are women, that, there was a man recently that was talking about how he wanted to become the first trans woman to have an abortion. That type of talking, where a man wants to become the first man to have a uterus implanted in him so that he could somehow conceive a baby that he could somehow abort, that is this new type of elite feminism that is honored by the left, by the Biden administration even.
At the White House with a big public event.
Where we're told that this is somehow irreproachable, untouchable, and to criticize someone for this is like the ultimate denial of love and of charity now, is that this is this elite type of womanhood. And I think that, ironically, and I say this carefully, I don't hate it, because I think that it has shown Americans, it really has radicalized a lot of Americans into understanding this is insane. This is not what we want.
Right.
Most Americans don't support transgender procedures for kids. They don't support men and women's spaces. They're rational about all of this. And so when we see this really radical forms of this, I think it repels them. Even the people who might, 10 years ago have been much stauncher liberals and been, arguing with conservatives on a lot of topics, I think are kind of taking a step back and saying, I don't want to be part of this group that is saying, for example, men can get pregnant because they know men cannot get pregnant.
Right.
And so I've watched a lot of this with interest because, I'll go to these protests as a reporter. I go to the Women's March. I go to the trans protests. And we will genuinely ask people very straight questions, trying to get a gauge on what they actually think about these things, because I think that's a really interesting way of showing the American public this is what the radical left thinks on this topic. From their own mouths, we're not twisting anything. Here's exactly what they think. And I love putting out that kind of content and seeing how people react to it, because across the board, what I see is you have very radical people saying, yes, we support this. And then most people are just looking at it like, what the heck?
Yeah.
What is this? Yeah. Where have we come? What has gotten into us? And so in some ways, I could see this type of radical behavior and attitudes being kind of a turning point for us in that the moderates or the people who might have been leaning left can come to a realization point and understand that a lot of these things that they thought were harmless are not at all.
Yeah, the Biden administration has used every women's issue, every sort of public event or every policy decision that traditionally focused on women. They've used it not to highlight or promote or acknowledge accomplishments by women. That's sort of the pretext. But they've used it to advance transgender ideology, in my view, at the expense of women.
Oh, for sure.
And nobody calls them on it. Instead of saying, hey, look, if you're going to have a Women's National Day of whatever, fill in the blank, well then, okay, go find the best women who do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
and acknowledge their merit and say this is terrific and give them an award. I mean, but they don't do that.
No.
They hold the event, and then they, bring out somebody like our Deputy Surgeon General, whatever his name is, who runs around in an admiral's uniform.
Rachel Levine.
Ray, no, you just remember. I couldn't remember. I'm going to say his name, and that's supposed to be terrific,
right?
As a women's issue, but it isn't a women's issue.
And the heralding of men as women, the first trans woman to XYZ, we hear this all the time. I think Riley Gaines is probably the best person I've seen recently. Riley Gaines, who had to swim against Leah or Will Thomas at the NCAAs, has been really good at calling this out recently and saying, you're honoring men for women's positions, and you're literally taking the status away from women when you honor men in this way.
Yeah.
But there doesn't seem to be any understanding of that. Maybe even on the part of people like Jill Biden, I've seen her say some of this rhetoric, and I always wonder, do you believe this, or are you just saying this?
Yeah.
Because as a woman, she's got to have some kind of understanding that this person in front of her is not a woman. It's a man, and she is honoring them as a woman. I would love, in a just world, I would love to do an interview with Jill Biden about what she actually thinks about all of this, because there's no way that there's not a moment of reckoning one night or another where she thinks, man, that can't really be a woman, or that's not actually a woman. Right.
And I've even seen old clips of then Senator Joe Biden on like Meet the Press or whatever, in the mid to late 90s, and he kind of almost gets angry. He has righteous indignation.
Right.
And a guy's a guy and a woman's a woman, and they get married and they have kids, and that's a family. He's all like, how dare you ask me about
such
gay
an
marriage
obvious question. Yeah.
Right. And so and of course they'll say he's evolved since then. But so things that we take for granted or that we think are normal obviously are not. You've written a book about it called Detrans to help document the horrific stories of these people who've gone through this process. If you don't have a copy, you're wrong. Go get a copy. Before we close out, is there something I should have asked you that I didn't, or something that you want to mention about your work or where you're going with this? Or
Well, I guess I should just say the last chapter of this book, the whole book is focused on the stories of detransitioners, except the last chapter is a story of what I'd called the alternative. So, these detransitioners made it. They're moving on to really, healthy, productive, fulfilled lives. But the very last chapter is about Yali Martinez, who is a little girl that ultimately threw herself in front of a train after she had been started on a transition by the state of California, taken from her family who wouldn't affirm her, started on testosterone, and she threw herself in front of a train. And this was a really hard chapter for me to write because I obtained the police reports from the officers who found her body and, describing finding a sneaker here and a leg there. It was the most horrific, gruesome thing I ever read. And then I had to talk to her mother, who sobbed to me on the phone. And she told me this is a pain that never goes away. And I think that I would be remiss if I didn't mention this because Abby Martinez is a huge reason why I wrote this and other parents who have been in this situation because we're told the gender-affirming care saves children from a fate like that, but it could not be more. That could not be more of a lie. And I think Abby's story and Yali's story should help people understand the absolute gravity of this and what it can do to our kids. And so, it's a sad note to end on. And I thought about it when I wrote the book. I thought maybe this is too hard, but I think it's important for people to understand. It is reality.
You have an obligation to report it. You really do.
It's the truth, and I think the truth will set us free. And that's what I was trying to do with this book.
And you've done a great job doing so. If folks want to follow your work and see what you're up to, and how do they follow you? Where do they find you?
Well, you can find me at dailysignal.com, on X or Twitter at Margaret Olohan, and I try and write a lot and keep things interesting, so would appreciate your support.
Margaret Olohan, senior reporter for Daily Signal, author of Detrans. Thank you so much for coming in. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks. I'm Chris Farrell on Watch.